Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tosh Talks. I'm your host, Tosh Berman. And today we're going to discuss a pair of songwriters who work together by the name of Howard and Alan Blaikley. They're, strangely enough, credited, when you look at a record label with their songs, they always credit themselves as Howard Blaikley, as one person. I don't know if they thought of themselves as one person or as two people, but that's how they credit themselves. Howard Blaikley, but actually it's Ken Howard and Alan Blaikley. And I first heard of these songwriters, well, actually, as a child, when I heard the Honeycombs' great song, Have I the Right, in 1964. And it was a record that I've always been fascinated with. Probably one of, if definitely in the top 3 favorite songs of all time, if not the favorite song. For some reason, that song always had a hold on me. And Have I the Right was performed and made by the Honeycombs and produced by Meek in London, 1964. And Howard and Blaikley first met in university in Oxford. They both went to Oxford, I believe. And at the time, they had a journal in the early 60s, which pretty much focused on, it was a journal published quarterly, and they focused pretty much on anything that was alternative culture at the time. And we're talking about like 61, 62. So they would do stuff like put out books about, or issues devoted to the British New Wave cinema at the time. Also, homosexuality, which was totally illegal. And there were 4 homosexual rights, gay rights. And also dealing with the world of drugs at the time. So they had a very much of an early interest in this counterculture in the early 60s. And eventually they, especially Blaikley, had a strong music background where he used to work with a choir and stuff. Eventually they joined up as a songwriting duo. And sometime in 63, or very early as 1964, I believe it was 1963, they found the Honeycombs, this band from North London. And they either brought the Honeycombs to Meek's attention, or Honeycombs arranged that themselves, the first meeting with Meek. And somewhere down the line, the Honeycombs became, I won't say, they're sort of totally under the control, at least musically, by Meek, who wrote some of the songs, as well as with Blaikley and Howard, who wrote all their songs for the first album. Meek did like the B-sides at times. And the Honeycombs sound, with a mixture of Meek, it was for me, irresistible sonic meeting. It's like Meek gave the Honeycombs a very strong drum sound by the drummer Honey. I can't say she's the first female drummer of all time, but the most famous first female drummer in a rock band. And there's strong percussion sounds, hand claps, drums, and very strange sort of electronic keyboard effect or electronics involved in the recording of the Honeycombs. And it's totally a Meek situation. And then with the songwriting by Blaikley and Howard, it doesn't sound operatic, but the themes are very highly romantic and highly sort of, not goth, but very despair-driven. It was very kind of, very emotional music. And the combination of Meek's electronics, the Honeycombs' performance, including the singer, Dennis O'Dale, who was a fantastic singer, and then the songs by Blaikley and Howard, which gives this sort of operatic, teenage angst type of feeling. And then the Honeycombs were very successful, especially with the song Have I the Right, which was a hit all over the world. Specifically, it made a presence in the United States, but also it made a huge presence in Japan during the early 60s. And then, as they were working with the Honeycombs, Blaikley and Howard started working with this other band, and who has the most ridiculous name ever. This is their album. British import. Dave Dee, Dozy, Beaky, Mick, and Tich. I cannot remember that name offhand because there's no abbreviation of the name. They're the first Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, but no. Dave Dee, that's one person. Dozy, Beaky, Mick, and Tich. And Blaikley and Howard discovered them in the same manner of discovering the Honeycombs, I think, at a local music club in England somewhere. And again, Blaikley and Howard wrote all their songs as well. They did some of the production, but they wrote all the songs. Now, compared to the Honeycombs, which I mentioned were kind of dramatic, kind of not goth in a vampire way, but a very dark, almost a suicidal presence to me. You know, it's always like, have I the right to love you? You know, it's like bam, 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 the strong emotional stance. Dave Dee, Dozy, Beaky, Mick, and Tich, and this for the sake, I'm just going to call him Dave Dee, but I mean the whole band. Dave Dee, quote unquote, were over the top pop music. As we think of British rock and roll, we always think we're having this sort of tinge of R&B, like American R&B or American soul music, or blues, black blues, that emerged into the music scene in Great Britain. Therefore, you have the Rolling Stones, even the Beatles. You know, they all have inspiration of, or background of black American music. Dave Dee has no essence of black music whatsoever. In fact, Howard Blaikley, or Ken Howard and Alan Blaikley, have no American influence whatsoever. It's basically hardcore British. And Dave Dee represents that aspect of them, of this sort of British centricity of sorts, where they just sort of focus on a little bit of like music hall music, but also the recordings of Dave Dee, and this is not a Joe Meek project, this is their project, have a lot of sound effects as well. The sounds of whips and sounds of gunshots and sounds of incredible like African percussion. And the songs that the most famous with Dave Dee is Bend It, which was a hit actually in America. And I rediscovered that song many years later because Gilbert and George had a performance piece where they used Bend It as the background where they do their where they did their dance, Gilbert and George. So they used Bend It, and that's how my rediscovery of Bend It. And then another song called Loos of England. And loo is a slang word, an English slang word for toilet. So Loos of England is basically about public toilets in England, which, going back to their interest in homosexual culture when they were in college, loos were famous for pickup places or places for men to have sex anonymously in these various public spaces. And this was especially during the time when homosexuality was not legal, and a lot of gay men would go to these loos to investigate their own sexuality. So what happened afterwards is basically, so they had another song called The Legend of Xanadu, and then they had Last Night in Soho, which is probably the ultimate Soho London song ever. It's overly dramatic, it's totally crazed, and fantastic. It's an incredible song. And then an interesting aspect of Dave Dee, I'm not talking about the whole band, but this Dave Dee himself, the lead singer, he was a police officer in the early 60s. And when Edry Cochran died in a car crash, Dave Dee was the first police officer at the premise at that car accident. And So he was there when Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran were in that horrible car accident. And Dave Dee eventually, many years later, before he passed away, became a justice of peace. He became like sort of a small-time judge in in a small village in England. So that's kind of interesting. Dave Dee was a cop, and he discovered Eddie Cochran dead at the site of this horrific car accident. And then a few years later, there was a band called The Herd, H-E-R-D, The Herd. And that was Peter Frampton's first band in the 60s. And as we all know, Peter Frampton now, we know Peter Frampton was sort of an iconic 1970s rock star. But before he was a 1970s rock star, Peter Frampton was a teen idol of sorts in 1965, 66, 67, 68. He was the face of 68. That's what the media called him at the time. And The Herd was a band, a four-piece band, who again, Blaikley and Howard took over and wrote all the songs, or most of the songs. Peter Frampton and Andy Brown, the co-member of The Herd, wrote some songs, but the hits were all done by Blaikley and Howard. And this is the American release of the Herd album. And their big songs, not the big song, they never had a big song, but the classic song is a piece called From the Underworld. Incredible record. And the other incredible recording by The Herd is Paradise Lost. And another, it's a weird combination of, it's a strange combination of very dramatic music that have a little bit traces of Procol Harum. We're talking about like 67, 68, but a strong presence of the Walker Brothers. And the Walker Brothers were at the time, were a big act, especially Scott Walker. So it's almost like The Herd was sort of almost like a bubblegum version of the Walker Brothers, if there's such a situation or combination. And oddly enough, though The Herd had basically three lead singers, including Peter Frampton, there was a bassist by the name of Gary Taylor, who actually had, he passed, I'm not sure if he's still with us, but he had that Scott Walker voice. And once in a while, when Peter Frampton's singing lead and when a Herd song, all of a sudden Taylor's voice will come in like Scott Walker, and it's like, wow, this is, it's like moments that stop. It's pretty amazing. And you can hear the traces of Dave Dee, Dozy, Beaky, Mick, and Tich in the Herd's music. And that what the combination thing is that they do have a sense of be over-the-top production, a lot of sound effects, a lot of echo, a lot of horns, sometimes strings, but done in a very arranged and a very crazed, almost like a musique concrete type of style or sensibility. And while Dave Dee is definitely more over-the-top pop, The Herd has almost a touch of the Small Faces, another band of four good-looking guys around exactly the same time. And the Brown and Frampton songs almost has a Small Faces type of sound. When they work with Howard and Blaikley, more over-the-top orchestration. So it's sort of this weird duality when you listen to a Herd album. And it's interesting to note that after The Herd, Peter Frampton joined forces with Steve Marriott of the Small Faces, just a band called Humble Pie, which I don't know too much about, but I know they have. Eventually, Humble Pie became a very heavy guitar band, like arena type of style rock or big theater rock, and totally not sounding like anything like The Herd. And then afterwards, Blaikley and Howard started another band or founded another band called Flaming Youth. And Flaming Youth is from 1969, and I don't actually have an album of theirs, but I just heard it online, and it's described as prog rock. And oddly enough, it was Phil Collins of Phil Collins fame, as well as the drummer for Genesis, his first band. And it's an interesting sound because it progresses from Dave Dee to the Herd to the sort of prog rock sound that Flaming Youth produced. So Blaikley and Howard wrote all the songs and did the production of this one album, which was not successful at all. And again, it's interesting to note this weird connection of the whole British 60s scene, that Phil Collins, besides being a drummer, was, at one time, of course, was a child, of course, but he was a child actor. So was Steve Marriott of Small Faces, was a child actor, and they both appeared in the original production of Lionel Bart's Oliver when it opened in London. So there's this weird, sort of Lionel Bart connection of sorts, as well as this child acting thing. And then Blaikley and Howard disappeared for a while. I don't know what happened to them. They're always like sort of phantom figures. If you look up on the internet, you can find very few photographs of them, as a fact. But what's interesting, in the 70s, they did an album with R.D. Laing, the famous controversial psychiatrist. They made an album called Life Before Death, recorded in 1978, and it's basically R.D. Laing reciting his poetry with music by Blaikley and Howard. So that's a strange combination. You have the bubblegum Dave Dee years and the sort of prototype power pop kind of bubblegum sound of the Herd. And then you had Joe Meek, who's insane, the Honeycombs. And then they ended up with R.D. Laing, one of the most, I won't say he's insane, because maybe he was insane, but R.D. Laing was famous for controversial views on psychiatry. He was considered anti-psychiatrist because he's a psychiatrist who didn't really believe in psychiatry drugs unless you're taking drugs for fun. And strange enough, when I read about Alan Blaikley, Blaikley ended up becoming a practicing psychiatrist. He left music for a while to become a psychiatrist. And during his psychiatrist years, he was in tune or joined up with R.D. Laing. Therefore, brought his partner Howard back into the scene, and they both produced and wrote R.D. Laing's Life Before Death. This is an album that's like a phantom record. You can't find it anywhere. I can't find it anywhere. There's listings for it, but nobody's selling their copy. Everybody's keeping the R.D. Laing album. And, as everybody knows who watch Tosh Talks, know that I have this sort of obsession about London or English culture. And when you look at somebody like Ken Howard and Alan Blaikley, they seem to be kind of minor players when you look overall compared to, say, like Jagger and Keith Richards and John Lennon and Paul McCartney or Ray Davies. They're not that huge of a figure, really. And it's argumentatively, maybe you can't take their music that seriously as you take the Kinks or the Stones or the Beatles more seriously. Yet, these two guys, if they didn't make the masterpiece painting, they did masterpiece drawings, sketches. They were great sketch artists of their time. And when you listen to like the first Honeycombs album, you're listening to, I think, greatness, a masterpiece. And then when you're listening to Dave Dee, Dozy, Beaky, Mick, and Tich recordings, you're listening to colorful watercolors of sorts. And then, of course, when you listen to the Herd, that's like an actual oil painting. And then you got R.D. Laing, which you're going back to the drawing again. So that's my visual interpretation of Howard and Blaikley's work. Also, it's noted that Dave Dee, Dozy, Mickey, Mick, and Tich auditioned for Joe Meek. And Joe Meek sat down with them in his home studio in North London and said, I want you guys, I'm gonna slow your music down. I'm gonna speed up certain parts of the tape, and I'm gonna add special effects. And this did not go well with Dave Dee at all. And when Dave Dee told this to Joe Meek, he didn't like this approach of recording their music that way. Meek apparently had a temper tantrum and immediately screamed and shouted. He was drinking coffee. I think he threw coffee at the band and he left the room. And that stopped the relationship between Joe Meek and Dave Dee and Mick Tich. Honeycombs stayed, of course. But nevertheless, the whole issues of this sort of counterculture of the early 60s and these guys starting their own publication in school, so they had literary ambitions, and the fact they did, I think, to me, remarkable music, and then India was already Laing, I think is a magnificent career. And this is Tosh Berman. This is Tosh Talks. Thank you.